a report just released by the UN that says roughly 1 million species are on the verge of extinction.
Day 3 of the Extinction Rebellion in London, and the disruptions spreading.
A group of students around the world is planning to skip class tomorrow.
The people in power have gotten away with not doing anything.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories we're covering this week. Dateline everywhere. Are the news media finally giving the climate change story the coverage it deserves? When television goes too far, a guest on a British program takes his own life. The show is now off the air for good. China goes to the movies in a patriotic way, and blockbusters are where the action is. And Algeria Online, where the revolution continues. It's one of those news stories, maybe the only one, that seems almost too big to cover. Climate change and the scientific consensus that the planet is almost at the point of no return. The evidence is overwhelming. The latest came just last week in that UN report, warning that roughly 1 million plant and animal species now face extinction. News outlets could cover climate change stories every day and still sell this story short. But they struggle to find the right way to cover the relentless onslaught of data that is newsworthy. Still, there are signs that things are changing. Corporate media, which have fed off natural disasters, covered floods and famines while shying away from larger causal issues, are now beginning to examine and link the global economic system to an issue that has brought us to the brink. Movements like the Extinction Rebellion and terms like the Green New Deal are trending, and for far longer than the standard 24-hour news cycle. Are these changes in coverage real? Will they last? Our starting point this week is the planet Earth.
Here, I've got an experiment for you. Safety glasses on.
Satire is at its most effective when it contains an element of truth. In this case, an inconvenient truth.
What I'm saying is the planet's on fire.
An American television personality, scientist Bill Nye, uses showmanship, props, and profanity to make his case on climate change. And a topic that, when covered conventionally, can struggle to attract clicks, quickly gets 4 million of them.
Safety glasses off.
Bill Nye clip is absolutely fantastic. On one level it was comedy, but on the other hand it was absolutely searingly concise in terms of the situation that we face. The planet is on fire at a scale, unimagined 20 years ago. Metaphorically, in every conceivable sense, we are destroying the oceans, the soil, the other species. The whole of life which supports our lives is being exponentially destroyed.
Climate science is very difficult to talk about. And you're talking about the 6th generation of climate science models coming up now with metadata and so on and so on. But I think this particular meme about a globe and the actor basically putting it on fire and basically saying we captured all of that in a very succinct way.
The climate crisis is a complex story to cover, but there's been a shift since the data has now grown so compelling you don't have to be a scientist to understand. There was the UN study from earlier this month warning that up to 1 million species, flora and fauna, could soon be extinct. A second UN body warned governments late last year they had 12 years to limit temperature rises to avoid a climate catastrophe.
A new report from the United Nations is painting a grim portrait of the state of our planet.
Both studies drew significant coverage, as did a recent wave of climate activism.
Hundreds of climate change activists marched towards Parliament. Their message: act now.
There were the school strikes in March, the brainchild of a 16-year-old Swede, Greta Thunberg, who became the face of the strikes and a focal point for the news media.
So student activist Greta Thunberg is with us now.
She joins me now from Stockholm, Sweden.
Thanks for joining us. You are an extraordinary young lady. Thank you very much for joining us.
The strikes went global, with more than 1 million students involved.
What do we want? Climate justice!
And then there was the Extinction Rebellion, the street movement born in London that was tired of playing by the rules and being ignored by the media. Last month, it disrupted traffic for days. All kinds of news cameras showed up, but rather than focus on the cause of the protests, many of them could not resist dwelling on the effects.
The seemingly mostly middle-class eco-activist temper tantrum, known as Extinction Rebellion, came to London and shut down much of the city.
It's absolute madness that a bunch of protesters brings London, huge capital city, to a standstill.
Still, mirror protests took place in 27 other countries, and for a while, climate change news was everywhere.
It was interesting to watch the framing of Extinction Rebellion in the UK. I think a lot of the response was, these are just privileged protesters going out into the streets. Don't they have jobs to do?
You're a load of incompetent, middle-class, self-indulgent people who want to tell us how to live our lives.
Which I don't think is the most honest or, good faith framing on the part of the media.
And I won't stand for anything else.
Jolly good.
A lot of folks who are coming into the streets are doing so because they recognize that climate change and, extinction crises pose a massive disruption to life as we know it.
What Extinction Rebellion has done, alongside obviously Greta Thunberg and the school strikes, I think it has changed the narrative around climate change. Even in the mainstream, you hear a lot of people now talking about the climate emergency, the climate crisis. But certainly I think the narrative has moved on. Since Extinction Rebellion has stopped, that issue has now faded off the agenda again to a significant extent.
The challenge now for Extinction Rebellion in the next phase is, they've had quite an effective media strategy. I think the challenge for them going forward is that we're all going to get tired of, good-natured and good-humoured posters about climate change and about biodiversity loss. But that isn't going to remain on our screens forever. So what happens next?
If it was up to climate activists, the answer would be new emission laws around the world. No country produces more carbon per capita than the United States, and the climate change debate there is now centered on what's called the Green New Deal. Proposed by progressive Democrats in Congress, the Green New Deal aims to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030. It's ambitious, and with cost estimates in the range of $10 trillion, expensive. That's partly because it proposes sweeping structural changes to the American economy that go well beyond the energy sector. The Green New Deal has generated extensive coverage, much of it serious and thoughtful. But when the debate makes it onto Fox, the most widely watched news channel in the country, the focus is less about science and economics and more about competing political ideologies.
We have to be brutally honest and say that these ideas are really dangerous.
Yeah.
And
what you get from most of the media, certainly the right wing, the Foxes and all the rest of it, an implication that it's just totally unrealistic and unfeasible.
The Green New Deal will save the planet. In exchange, we just give up cars and airplanes and rebuild every structure in the United States.
And the problem in the media is that they're complicit with the way politicians frame any change as a change that is going to happen to the average taxpayer. When it comes to climate change, this is not about the average person, getting hit in the pocket. It's about those that have the most responsibility and the most, luxury and space to be able to make the changes without it affecting their lives too much. It's really about turning the lens back on them.
And the problem is the fact that we live in an economic system which is very deeply unsustainable, and that we sort of premise our notions of economic success on indefinite growth and growing the economy exponentially. The goal of an economy is to grow its GDP by 3% every year. That still presents a tremendous stress on the Earth's ecosystems. And that, I think, is the conversation that is very hard to have in the mainstream media, but that absolutely needs to be a central part of the conversation. Why not call into question sort of our fixation on economic growth as the only metric of well-being, which it's not a terribly good metric of well-being.
This is a globalized media model. It's very financialized. It's about media ratings. It's about what sells. It's highly sensationalized. But you're also beginning to see a more concerted effort to mainstream a climate focus. There is the issue of funding and resourcing, etc. But at least in that context, that shift is happening.
The climate change story is also being told on platforms in ways it hasn't been told before. Greenpeace has never been shy about getting its environmental message out. Last year, it added an investigative unit to examine the measurable effects of climate change and to dig into the corporate PR side of the story, journalistically documenting the money fossil fuel companies spend to lobby governments. And Netflix, which makes most of its money through fictional content, films, and TV series, recently added a climate change series fronted by David Attenborough. Attenborough is best known for making picture-rich wildlife documentaries at Britain's BBC. 6 months ago, he was criticized in The Guardian for missing the bigger picture. As one of the British paper's columnists put it, Attenborough and his team were telling a false story, creating a fairy tale world that persuades us all is well in the midst of an existential crisis.
And that led to David Attenborough having been publicly called out in the media, then making with Netflix this incredibly powerful series called Our Planet that differs very significantly from his previous work.
For the first time in human history, the stability of nature can no longer be taken for granted.
Placing the wonders of nature alongside the catastrophe. And I think that combination is absolutely vital.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Johanna Hoos. Joe, the former U.S. Army intelligence analyst and WikiLeaks whistleblower, Chelsea Manning, is back in jail just 7 days after being released. What are the details here?
Well, Richard, Manning was sent back to prison for refusing to testify before a grand jury over her contact with WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange, back in 2010. Now, the judge seems to be tightening the screws. Not only is Manning back in jail after having already served 62 days for similar charges earlier this year, if she continues to refuse to give evidence, she will be fined $500 a day after the first 30 days, rising to $1,000 a day after 60 days. Now, these grand jury investigations are completely closed to the public, and that includes the media. But what we do know is that this is an investigation into WikiLeaks. And it's in the lead up to what prosecutors hope will be a criminal trial of Assange, who has been charged with conspiring with Manning to break into Pentagon computers to get access to a trove of secret military documents and State Department cables. Manning says she refuses to answer questions.
I will not cooperate with this or any other grand jury.
That's because she's already given her testimony during her trial in 2013, after which she was convicted and jailed for 7 years before her sentence was commuted in 2017 by President Barack Obama.
Okay, turning to the UK now, where a suicide has led to the cancellation of a long-running television program, The Jeremy Kyle Show, as well as some uncomfortable questions on the ethics that lie behind certain television formats. First of all, what kind of program are we talking about here?
Well, Richard, it was very much a tabloid TV-style program modeled on the Jerry Springer Show in the US. It featured members of the public fighting very personal battles in front of a live audience, facing confrontational questions from the host, often to solve or perhaps exploit these family disputes. Now, it aired for 14 years on ITV in the UK, but that channel pulled the plug following the death of Steve Diamond, a participant who reportedly took his own life a week after a studio taping. Now, Diamond was asked to take a lie detector test to convince his fiancée that he had not been unfaithful. He failed the test, but this story has raised questions about the impact these kind of programs can have on the mental state of their participants.
Okay, thanks, Joe. To China now, a country that's been flexing its media muscle, and not just in the news realm. For all of the attention that Hollywood and Bollywood attract, the past 2 years have produced the 3 highest-grossing movies in China's cinematic history. Wolf Warrior 2, Operation Red Sea, and The Wandering Earth have different settings and themes, but they're all action films. And look beyond the gratuitous violence, implausible plot lines, and special effects, and you'll detect some jingoistic themes that are very much in line with President Xi Jinping's brand of national assertiveness. Throw in some government backing, either tacit or financial, and these films take on a very different feel. Cinema has always played a central role in the media strategy of the Communist Party. Are we simply seeing more celluloid-based propaganda revamped for the 21st century, or just a market-based response to the demands of Chinese movie-going audiences? The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the new blockbusters of Chinese cinema.
They're blockbuster action films, made in China with a Chinese cast, but almost none of them are actually set in China. Wolf Warrior 2 was released in July 2017. In an unnamed African country, workers in a Chinese factory are taken hostage by mercenaries from Europe.
I've told you too many times that we cannot kill the Chinese. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
The action hero is actor and director Wu Jing, who plays an ex-military man.
People like you will always be inferior to people like me. Get used to it.
With $875 million in box office earnings, Wolf Warrior 2 is not just the highest-grossing film ever made or distributed in China. It's the highest-grossing non-English language film of all time. Operation Red Sea, which came out in February 2018, is based in a fictional country modeled on Yemen called Yewer. And The Wandering Earth, released in February this year, takes Chinese cinema even further afield. It's a science fiction film set in space. Together, these are the three most commercially successful Chinese films ever released, and they all tell stories of China's growing international power.
At the end of Wolf Warrior 2, there's a Chinese passport on screen with a slogan, wherever you are in the world, the government of the country is always behind you. So that conveys a very strong nationalist message to the audience, and something probably unavoidable in a mainstream film released in China.
These are different from previous propaganda nationalist movies which came out of the state sector. They have budgets that are large enough to accommodate top actors, good locations, and quality special effects. In other words, these are Chinese movies being made on a Hollywood scale about subjects that might have been, in the past, considered as state-made propagandist subjects.
Chinese cinema has come a long way since its days as a mere messaging vehicle for the Communist Party. Films of the 50s and 60s, such as The White-Haired Girl, The Battle on Shang'anling Mountain, and The Red Detachment of Women, were all aimed at spreading a unifying message, a communist vision to knit a vast, divided country together. By the 1990s, Beijing had shifted from communism to a more market-driven system. Chinese cinema found a new impetus, the possibility of commercial success. Led by the example of movie makers in Hong Kong, filmmakers on the mainland started experimenting with new genres: action movies, period dramas, chick flicks, rom-coms, even satire.
It was clear to mainland Chinese producers just how much potential their domestic market had. Having come of age watching Hong Kong cinema in the 80s and 90s, they began to invite filmmakers from there to come over. Hong Kong's film industry offered a model for China. It was diverse, it had stars, and it played with different genres.
What's interesting about some of these films is precisely because of the popularity of the people involved, they can push the envelope a little bit. Feng Xiaogang's film Big Shot's Funeral had a lot of comedy revolved around product placement. This was a very cynical way of making money by putting large corporations' products into the film. But at the same time, the story of the film was about the corruption of everyday life by advertising and market culture. And Feng Xiaogang's films are full of that kind of rather cynical approach to Chinese culture and life today.
Cynicism, satire, critique. Once they get past the censors, they can attract sizable audiences. The 2012 comedy Lost in Thailand made a spectacle of Chinese materialism. In 2016, The Mermaid, a fantasy romance comedy, pushed an unabashed critique of environmental negligence in China. Both films topped the box office. It's about more than just money, though. There have been occasions when a film can actually make a political difference. 2018's Dying to Survive was based on the true story of one man's mission to smuggle cheap cancer medicine from India into China. It generated such a response that the government was forced to announce new policies on drug pricing. Perhaps inspired or possibly put on notice by the pull of such films, Beijing has doubled down on cinema as a tool for its own purposes. It's resulted in what's called Zhu Suan Lu, or main melody filmmaking, fusing typical Chinese political messaging with the production values, budgets, and mass market appeal of commercial cinema.
Main melody films have become even more popular under the current government. Younger generation film viewers didn't go through the previous decades, and it's easier for them to accept this type of films than older generation, say born in 1960s, 70s. This is also to do with the production quality of those films.
In the past, the propaganda films mostly came out of the state-owned studios. The restructuring that took place in 2000, 2001 saw many of those studios disappear, get consolidated, and were frankly overtaken by private sector companies. And then after a few years of this, we've also seen the state sector learning from what the private sector was doing.
As soon as Chinese filmmakers learnt how to make films with messages that the Communist Party liked, but with a Hollywood system, movie stars, genres, etc., and the box office then picked up, you've got a situation where the Chinese film industry is delivering popular films that at the same time meet the requirements of the party.
Superhit films are of growing importance for the Communist Party's media strategy. Last year, the state film and television regulator was abolished and cinema was brought under the control of China's quite forthrightly named propaganda department. And aside from the routine censoring of films, the government has singled out directors, investors, and film stars for disciplinary action. The message cannot be missed. No matter how successful Chinese commercial cinema is, Beijing remains the power center, and it will use its labyrinthine set of rules and laws to determine what's allowed and what's not.
I think there's very vague what you can do, what you can't do. Some people do something without running into trouble. Some people do the same thing, but they get into trouble. And it's also not just based on the current rules, no, but also the current political circumstances, environment, and so on.
Instances of content being removed after films are made are reducing in frequency. This doesn't necessarily mean there's more self-censorship. Rather, there's mutual understanding. For example, if I feel there's injustices taking place, things that make us angry or unhappy, I want to shout about them, place them front and center. Instead, you must wrap them up and place your critique in deeper and deeper layers of cinema.
There is a paradox in Chinese cinema today. The more audiences Chinese films attract, the more earnings they bring, the closer is the scrutiny they come under from the state. China is ramping up its messaging, not just inside the country, but globally as well. And big-budget films could spur a new age of Chinese soft power. With sequels to Wolf Warrior 2 and Operation Red Sea already underway, Chinese filmmakers could find their work being watched much more closely by Beijing than ever before.
And finally, it has been 6 weeks now since Algeria's president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, was forced out of office following weeks of mass unrest, but the calls for political reform keep on coming. Social media was where the people mobilized. It's one of the few spaces for criticism of the government, since the domestic, state-approved news media rarely make room for dissenting voices. Raja Meziane is an Algerian musician and YouTube star, one of many using music to push socio-political material, often to the annoyance of the regime. Her work has forced her to leave the country. That happened 4 years ago, but it did not silence her. One of her latest songs, called Allô le système, has now amassed more than 25 million views. She makes the point that the changes made so far by the Algerian powers that be are not nearly enough. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.